you for being here. This is a philosophy weekend at the Reykjavik Art Museum, because tomorrow at Kjarvalsstaðir at 3 o'clock, Björn Thorsteinsson is going to talk about existentialism in connection with the exhibition we have at Kjarvalsstaðir now that has to do with abstract expressionism and that period, intellectual pursuit. I'm not going to be very philosophical, but I'm going to talk briefly about the ideas behind the exhibition. Johanna Fells, the exhibition kind of revolves around him. There is an installation by Þór Elís Pálsson that is homage to Johann. You may know Johann. He is Icelandic artist who has lived in the United States for many decades, is still alive and well at 89 and doing art every day. These are two works that are kind of representative, partly representative of what he does, work with process, progress over time. Time is an important concept here. He basically lays down cloth or paper in a slurry and puts metals on top of it in both these cases, and allows time and nature to create the work. And this is something that brings all of the artists in the exhibition together, this kind of process. Artist who, of course, comes immediately to mind when we're talking about this way of working is Tetreau, who started first in 1964 and again later in the decade to work with cheese and other foodstuff, allowing it to progress over time, basically rotten. This is a very famous work that he did at a gallery in California, where he had 39 suitcases full of cheese, and over time the cheese rotted and the smell was awful, and the maggots and the flies. Finally the exhibition had to be closed down, but he continued to work with food. Incel Islands is very important work by him. This comes to mind, but as far as I can tell, this notion, the first contemporary artist who really starts to work with these notions of time and process and let nature take its course, is Marcel Duchamp. Who else? Everything comes from Marcel Duchamp. So I just saw an exhibition in Stockholm that was called Picasso, Duchamp, Who Won? And I think in this exhibition it was Duchamp. And in 1920, you may have read this, he is here contemplating creating a work by letting dust gather for months and then coming and changing it. And this was what he did. He was working on the big glass, a very famous work that he did. I think he had a big glass in New York. He went to Paris or France for 8 months that year, left the glass laying horizontally flat, and gathered dust in accordance with his notes. And when he came back, he got his friend Man Ray to photograph it, and you see here the chocolate grinder and the bachelor machine up there, and then he dusted part of the dust away and fixed it in an area. This is an artwork that doesn't exist any longer, other than in copies. So this is around 1920, and what is important here is that he allows the time to take place. Another thing is important, that he lets the process happen on its own. He takes his hands away. He's not controlling it. It's a bit like his ready-mades. other than here the notion of coincidence or chance and unforeseeability comes in, whereas ready-made he just goes and chooses. And these artists started to work with this. This is a work by Robert Rauschenberg, dirt painting for John Cage, 1953. It's very early, 1953, where he basically stuffed dirt into a wooden frame that he then hung on the wall as a painting. It's dirt with mold on it that creates this interesting surface and it constantly changes. He made a whole series of these. So in some of them there were grass seeds that then he watered and allowed to grow and change. Another important artist is William Anastasia, artist who is far too little known now. He was important in New York on those days, but he laid out piece of carbon steel and then watered it daily and allowed it to change, and the artwork was basically the outcome of this process. And the patina, please notice that how it looks, because I think that is significant in what comes later. Terry Fouchard Wilcox is an artist in New York who has done work like this in public places. Those of you who are old enough to have spent some time in Soho in New York may remember this piece, this wall, where it's basically these shelves or horizontal bars that of different metals, and the rain washes it down. This artist was a part of a group of artists who called this way of working actual art. There was an art critic from San Francisco who sometime in the 70s wrote an essay about a review of this kind of way of working, and because the word realism was taken, he just coined this word actual art. It's not a term that I feel that's necessary for us to adopt. This artist I just learned about, Michael Tetreau, this is a painting that he worked on. His studio was in East Hampton, where he basically worked outside on canvas, but rain and snow on the canvases and whatever fell on them became a part of the work. So basically letting go also. Now in Iceland there are some very interesting examples. One example that I didn't, or two examples I didn't have decent, very good telling pictures of is work by Christian Guðmundsson from 1969, which is called Environmental Sculpture, where he took ironing board to a hen house and left it there, allowing basically the shit gather on that. And that is the painting. Ólafur Lárusson did something like that a little later in Flatey, where he allowed the tern do their thing on the canvas. I think that Nickolas knows that painting. I'm not sure though, haven't seen it. But this is a piece by Hafþór Yngvason from that sculpture exhibition along the shoreline that he just told me about. When you do an exhibition like that, like this, you start to hear about all of the works and connections that are related to this. He basically put out a large square, I think 5 meters in 5 by 5 meters of glass. Hafþór Yngvason always works with glass. Put it flat horizontally on the ground, and then just left it for whatever would happen to it. And it was of course broken, and with time, and then the city came and put grass over it. That was not Thor's idea, but he welcomed it, allowed it to happen, and this piece is still there, existing with the changes of time in decades. Here's another piece from that same exhibition by Borghildur Óskarsdóttir. Now I don't know whether Borghildur foresaw that or envisioned, or it was part of a plan that this writing would disappear, but she put this writing, spelling out, big letters spelling out nature on a beach, and with time, of course, it just sank into the ground. And I think it's a beautiful example of nature. That's what happens in nature, whether she intended it or not. I think it's a wonderful piece. Back to Johanna Fells. These works, you may know, Reykjavíkurvarðan on Klambratún and Íslandsvarðan now by the shore. The one on the left, concrete, the one on the right is bronze. And okay, that was the last one. But I want to make a point about that one, in that and make some differences why I brought these artists together and these works. Of course, these artists work in different ways, and there are a variety of things going on in their work. Johanna Fells has this incredible philosophy about what he's doing. I'm not going to try to interpret it, but some of it comes through in Þór Elí's installation and this emphasis on the center. I won't go into that, but what I'm particularly interested in this process works. And you may know different works by the artists like Ragnar and others, different works. But what brings this exhibition together is this process work. But not only that, why didn't I bring Kristján Guðmundsson piece in, Tetreau and Ólafur Lárusson and so forth? Because I think there are certain differences in the way they work. Although the notion of time, the notion of process, organic process even, this letting go, leaving it to a process that is impersonal. It's different ways that they're working. The works in the exhibition, and I trust that all of you have seen the exhibition or will go see it after this. It's basically, other than Þór Elí's work, I think it's all painting and photography, but it's work that to my mind is somewhat self-reflexive. I think the artists are telling us something about what photography can be, what painting can be. I think that they're dealing with the medium, partly. Of course, much more going on. Another thing is that these works all differ from the work of Ólafur Lárusson and Kristján Guðmundsson. When Kristján takes his ironing board, canvas to hen house, the droppings come from somewhere else. They by accident and process, they fall on the surface, and that creates a painting, just like Duchamp let the dust fall. These 5 artists in the exhibition, they all create work somehow with materials, letting the materials create the surface from inside. It's a natural process. It's different from Robert Rauschenberg, who puts earth into this frame. Very important work, and maybe appreciative of earth art, but he is basically creating a sample or a sampler of the material of the earth. the earth doesn't do much, so then of course it molds. But if you look at the pieces, for instance, of Guðrún Einarsdóttir, who and look at the surface, she is playing with her materials. She is mixing her oils differently, allowing messing with the drying process, extending it, making it take 12 to 14 months, and at the same time create this incredible surface through chemical process. And the outcome, in my mind, or my eye at least, is nature. It is looks like a volcanic activity. Same with Harpa Árnadóttir with her paintings, or cracks paintings, these white surfaces which she creates by painting with color and then with glue that contracts and softens and contracts and softens, with outcome that the surface cracks. To my mind, it's also an internal process of the painting surface. It again feels like nature, looks like nature. It looks like a glacier to my mind, my eye. Not because he is painting an imitation of a glacier, but because the process happens somewhat similarly as in nature. And you can extend that. You can talk about Ragnar Róbertsdóttir and her use of salt, and Solveig Aðalsteinsdóttir use of the photography process. The photography process in her hands happens on its own internally. It's not something that comes from outside. And this, I think these notions are something that brings these work together in such a way that the pieces by Christian Guðmundsson would not fit into that, nor even Tetreau, because even if the rotting of the cheese happens from inside, it's not in a regular way painting material or a painting that's come out. He is, to say, extending the medium, as people were doing so much in the 60s and 70s, literally trying to extend the notion of what could count as an artwork, without having to be a painting or sculpture. Whereas this exhibition has to do with artists not literally trying to extend the process, extend our this open concept of what is artwork, but rather trying to define what it could be, telling us it could be it does not depend on the artist's touch. It does not depend on a finish, but is something that can happen internally to it. I think I stop here, getting into deep water.
Thank you. Thank you to the museum for inviting me here today, as well, of course, as the University of Iceland for bringing me to Reykjavik. And this exhibition that I've found so compelling, that I just want to say a few words about now. This is certainly not the first philosophical conversation I will have had with Hafþór Yngvason. We've had many over the years. This one's just a little unusual because it's the first one we're going to have in public. So let's see how that goes. Well, in my opinion, in philosophy, there are two ways to talk about a subject. You can go up very close to it and describe it, or you can start some distance away and move toward it. And I want to respond to the exhibition that's in the museum today by starting some distance away, and I hope moving close to it. Starting with a question that almost can't be made sense of as it stands, the question, natural art. How would you imagine natural art? Is it like imagining a minotaur, which you do by combining two things you've seen, a bull's head and a man's body? So do we say an art head goes on a body of nature? Or is it more like imagining a circle with corners, where the two different things you've seen cannot go together? I think that would have been Gerhard Richter's reaction in 1962 when he said, art has always operated against nature and for reason. As it stands, this is not one of those philosophical questions that presents us with problems we cannot bring to a conclusion. There are many such philosophical questions you don't know how to resolve them. Did the universe have a beginning? This is more a situation in which we're not sure where to begin or how to approach the question. One way you might think about natural art is if you find moments when nature appears to act as artists do. Do you say that nature combines with art when you find a rock, for example, worn away by water so it happens to look like your grandmother? The effect, an unusual rock, but still. The effect might be an image, as art sometimes makes an image, but the process involved does not show us much about nature. You're glimpsing nature in a random moment, not, as it were, when nature is doing its normal job. Maybe better examples would be mimicry. The zebra that blends in among trees and shadows, the owl butterfly whose wings look like the eyes of a large bird. This is called Batesian mimicry, in fact. Is this natural artistry? Well, to approach this question then, now that I've narrowed it down a little, I want to do what I always do. I consult two philosophers who never fully agree with one another, Plato and Aristotle, because one of them is more likely to be moving toward my concerns. Now, I believe Plato was thinking about natural mimicry when he outlined a general theory of mimetike, the profession or the techne, or the art of imitation, in his dialogue, The Sophist. Now, this word techne does not correspond precisely to art, a modern term for which the Greeks possessed no equivalent, but techne does entail, on the one hand, human skill, hence the words technique and technology, and in Icelandic, is it tekne? Yes. And so I don't have to keep explaining what tekne means here. So tekne, the Greek word, does entail on the one hand human skill, and on the other hand some relationship to poetry and painting, each of which is called an imitative tekne. This combination of meanings puts the word tekne quite close to art. In the Sophist, Plato distinguishes between two ways of making images, human and divine. Divinities are at work in the production of shadows, reflections, and the apparitions that come to us in dreams. Zebra camouflage and butterfly wing mimicry would probably go into the same category. Plato says that the things we call natural are made by divine techne. From the point of view of our question, this leaves him describing our problem about natural art but then walking away from it. The problem is not that Plato talks about the gods, but that his distinction does not confront the difference that I'm worried about, the difference between nature and techne. Nature turns into one more type of techne, so we have no tension at work between the two. Now Aristotle returns to the subject, and he uses the same key words, techne, imitation, and nature, but in a new arrangement. What Aristotle says, and he says this several times in his corpus, is that every techne, every art, imitates nature. Well, that's quite a difference already. For Plato, imitation is one kind of techne. For Aristotle, techne is one kind of imitation. For Plato, in other words, expert activity is already understood. It's clear. He needs to explain the one type of this activity that makes images. For Aristotle, imitation goes without saying. This is what we do. We imitate. We act like our parents. We draw animals. And because we imitate, we come to imitate what nature does, and expert activity is the result. Now, on one of the occasions that Aristotle says every techne imitates nature, he adds a significant clause, and on one occasion he gives a strange example. The significant clause he adds is that techne, he says, it imitates nature, and he says, and it also completes what nature cannot accomplish. As for the example, the strange example he gives, it is cooking. I mean, of course cooking is a techne, of course it's an art, but what Aristotle says about it is it imitates human digestion. It imitates animal digestion. So you picture food boiling in the pot as a reenactment of what happens to food in your stomach as it mixes and gets soft in the heat. And this might even count as one of the examples, one of the cases in which the human skill completes what nature is unable to do, because food can get hotter in a boiling pot than it can inside your body. Now also notice, Aristotle changes imitation. So that it's no longer the copying of objects, which was Plato's assumption. Now it's copying processes. We imitate nature by doing what nature does. Nature is now a field of activities, not a collection of objects. Nature is not the landscape. It's not the deer running through the landscape. It's the geological changes that shaped the valley and the natural selection that filled it with life. Those of you familiar with Aristotle and Plato, by the way, on the nature of tragedy, might recognize the same difference between them, where Plato says that a tragedy imitates human beings, and Aristotle says a tragedy imitates an action. I had not noticed this similarity until I was thinking about this exhibition. The philosopher Alan Carlson, who in recent decades has inspired debates over the aesthetic appreciation of nature, appeals to natural processes to explain why admiring a landscape is not the genuine appreciation of nature. To stand on a hill and look across a valley is to treat this scene as if it were a painting, as opposed to immersing yourself in studying the biological, physical, and chemical laws that account for this ecosystem. What you really appreciate in nature is what science tells us about nature. Now, the objects we're thinking about today could be any objects at all. At the same time, they have been selected and prepared for exhibition. This double nature they possess, both ordinary and outstanding, is what I would like to focus in on in the remainder of my remarks. They are any objects at all because they're subject to oxidation, erosion, and other processes we find at work around the world, in our homes, certainly in our own bodies. I remarked to Hafþór yesterday, looking at Johann Eiffel's large folded cloth, how different it would be if oxidation did not affect my own body. You know, if the processes that worked on this cloth were not also working on me. Now these objects are ordinary things, reminiscent of what Stanley Cavell calls generic objects. Thus, Marcel Duchamp's sheet of glass gathering dust, and the sheet of cloth lying in slurry with metals on it. At the same time, we have to remember why these things, out of all possible things, are collected together in a museum. In addition to being generic, they're special objects. They've been set up in order to highlight what might be overlooked when these objects are somewhere else, namely to highlight the processes at work on them. Gudrun Einarsdottir mixes paints and oils together in experimental combination. Harpa Arnardottir prepares her canvases before making them available for us to see. These are exemplary objects, by which I mean both examples of anything at all and standout cases. The film theorist André Bazin said something about photography that brings us to nature by a different route. He claims that the photograph strikes a viewer as natural objects do, as a presence unmediated by human intention. Bazin doesn't mean a photograph taken of nature. He means that photographs bring their objects into nature, represent them naturally. Now, the camera, of course, had appeared to mark the beginning of new degrees of artifice in pictorial art. But Bazin's metaphor sees the camera as nature, even sees the camera as a return to nature. The effect of the natural inexorability in photography is to put an end to pictorial representation. Your face in the photograph is not an imitation of you, as a drawing is. It's more like a footprint or a fingerprint. It's the effect of you. Whether or not you accept Bazin's analysis of photography, this last claim applies to the objects in the museum. And unfortunately, now that photography has changed, digital photography, we no longer can think of it, I think, in the ways that Bazin could think of it, when you had essentially a lens and you had a silver emulsion on film. You also had the sense that photographs were very hard to manipulate, whereas now it's almost easier to manipulate than to imagine what they're like unmanipulated. So it's an old-fashioned metaphor, but it will move us toward the works in this exhibition, which I say, they are not pictures, they're not portrayals of other objects. They stage nature, nature understood as activity, not objects. These exhibits are places where nature works, and also places where that working reveals itself. Somewhat as Bazin might have said back in those days, that silver tarnishes everywhere, light refracts everywhere, but only a camera refracts light with a lens to make the silver tarnish so as to produce a photographic image. But still, this analogy is not specific enough, because photography puts light and oxidation to work to issue in a new product, the photograph. But in the present pieces, the process is the artwork. The object that stages the work might be seen as a slow-motion version of setting up a long row of dominoes, only to knock the first one over, to watch as each domino knocks down the next one. The delight in seeing dominoes fall, once they've been set up just right, begins in the knowledge that the human contribution is modest and very specific. You tap this domino, gravity does everything else. You might find it plausible to say that the result is an imitation of nature. The falling dominoes imitate an avalanche, and Ragnar Robertsdottir's evaporating salt water imitates the residue left by a shrinking sea. But now come back to the other thing Aristotle said, that a techne can complete what nature is incapable of accomplishing. Now, of all the philosophers, of all the Greek philosophers to say this, Aristotle is the most unexpected. Aristotle famously finds the natural world to exist already in its perfect state. He was the first Greek philosopher who set out to understand natural change not as chaotic, but as coherent, accessible to inquiry. So why talk about completing the work of nature? How could there be anything left to do? I want to finish by raising one possibility of what he could mean there, because it applies to us today and to the works we're thinking about. The scholar Jonathan Lear has described what Aristotle understands as nature's unawareness of itself. The natural world is perfect, but it does not know its own perfection. It does not have the power to know itself. In this respect, it needs to be completed. The goal for the human being is to learn and to contemplate the natural world as the final touch to the perfection that nature already possesses. But many natural processes take place too quickly to be experienced. Others unfold too slowly for us to notice, like evolution and continental drift. What if you could find, or what if you could make, something that takes place at an intermediate speed? This might be like what Aristotle says in the Poetics about playwrights writing tragedies that are neither too long nor too short, so the audience can perceive their beauty. If the speed is just right, between fast and slow, then you have staged a natural process so that it is suitable for observation, which is to say, brought to the consciousness of the viewer, which is to say, completed. Thank you.